Good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon.
How many of you people have not been here before? Yeah, a number of you, and I know a lot of the students, Mr. Pavlak's students, have not been here before. Well, welcome. We're glad to have you here. We always like to have new people, and we especially enjoy having our regulars, our returnees. As you were introduced, I am Judy Jeffers. I'm on the board of directors here at the Bay County Historical Society, and it's my job to welcome all of you when you come down here. And it's a beautiful day. There's no reason why you can't be out here enjoying a cemetery. How about that? Make sure your cell phones are turned off, please. And I'm going to introduce to you first I don't have other people to introduce today, so I will introduce to you Chelsea Berg. Chelsea was born and raised in the Saginaw Valley region. She's a 2015 graduate of Saginaw Valley University. She's now an English and history teacher at Dow High School in Midland. She has an immense passion for anything history. She believes that as an educator, there's nothing more important than constantly learning the unique stories of the past in order to preserve and share them with future generations. Copies of her, you've already heard about her book. There's some up here, and I don't know, are you going to be selling them here, Chelsea, or in the store?
No, I'll be here for a little bit after.
Okay, so you can buy them from Chelsea right here. Our next presentation is going to be the story of Herman Hiss and Company Jewelers with Tom Tabor, who I think his great-grandfather was the founder of Herman Hiss and Company. And that, I don't think he brings samples. It's too bad. But he's the great-grandson. That'll be our last presentation for 2018, and that's November the 10th. And then we'll start up again in January with Rick Mixter, who will do his wonderful, how many of you have seen Rick Mixter here? Yes, he does a wonderful job. He brings in a good crowd of people. He's an interesting gentleman. And that's about all I have. So with that, I will give you Chelsea Berg.
First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for being here today. This isn't probably the most appealing topic to most of you, so I'm glad to see so many people that came out to listen to someone talk about a cemetery, which is something that I never thought I would be standing in front of a group of people talking about either. And so I'm just going to start out the presentation before I talk about the cemetery itself, just talking a little bit about how this project came about, because like I said, it is an unusual topic and something I never in a million years imagined I'd be writing about. Growing up, I always told my parents I was going to be a teacher, author, and historian. I just didn't imagine it would happen this quickly or that this would be what I was writing about. As it was mentioned, I did go to Saginaw Valley State University, and toward the end of my time there, I was given an interesting opportunity by one of my professors in the English department. I was working as a research assistant for her on an unrelated topic, and she knew that history was something I was passionate about, and she had actually heard an advertisement for the Friends of Pine Ridge on the radio while she was walking on her treadmill. She would be very unhappy with me if she knew I just said that. And so she mentioned to me, she's like, can you look into this a little bit and see if there's a project here? Because SVSU is always looking to work on projects in the community and get students out there and involved with things. And so I did some initial research for her, and I took her the paper and I slid it over to her, and I said, going to give you this now, because if I keep it in my possession much longer, I'm going to be committed to it and not want anyone else to do it. The intention was never that I would be the one to write the book. I was in my final year at SVSU. I was getting ready to student teach. Obviously was going to be busy with that. And so I handed it over to her and sort of forgot about it. And then several months later, she came to me and said, there's no one else that I want to do this project. Are you willing to take it on while you're student teaching? And I foolishly said yes, because I didn't want anyone else to do it. And so then it started in early 2015. We got the go-ahead from the Office of the Associate Provost, who would be funding the project, to start the research and the writing. And then it went from there. So all of 2016 was spent researching. I spent a lot of time in the cemetery, talking to numerous people who know a lot more about it than I even still do. I worked a lot with Clara Pasco here in the research library. and Ron Graham, who is the caretaker at the cemetery, and numerous other individuals and local historians. I worked with Ann Haynes, who works out at Elm Lawn Cemetery, because the stories of the two really intertwine with one another, as you'll see in a little bit. And months of research finally evolved into a first draft of the book. Students in the professional writing program at SVSU did all of the editing and final formatting of the book. I drew them a terrible picture of what I wanted the cover to look like, and they made it happen. And then finally, after two and a half very long years, in the spring of 2017, it was published, and I finally got the chance to type my name into Amazon and have a product come up. And one of the coolest things was the day that Amazon sent me a product suggestion email for my own book. Had to take a screenshot of that one to save it, because that doesn't happen very often. So cemeteries terrified me until I was probably 12 or 13. I would have cried if you would have told me I had to go into one. So I find it very ironic that now I'm standing in front of you today talking about the book that I wrote about one. So I'm not going to read the book to you today, although I would love to do that. So I'm just going to do a bit of an overview on each of the chapters and some of the stories that stand out to me or that I've enjoyed over time. While I was writing, I would talk to anyone and everyone about what I was writing about, whether they wanted to hear about it or not. So I'm excited to talk to an audience that is actually interested in hearing about the cemetery today, too. So the first chapter of the book talks about the history of the cemetery and where it came from. So what you see on the screen now is a quote from an 1868 Bay City directory. So it was sort of an advertisement, if you will, for the cemetery. And it describes it as being very quaint and kind of a nice place to be, spending the rest of your life after death. It refers to it as a retired and quiet rest place of those who once took part in life's busy scenes and who, though dead, yet live in memories. And it goes on to talk about how the names of the streets are named after different plants and trees, which you can see very finely on the plot chart, which is difficult to read because it is old, but we can still see the layout and how those streets fit in there today when you visit the cemetery. So the cemetery was founded, and this is the plot chart that you can see. The cemetery was founded in 1858 by Judge James Burnie. He created it as a burial place for his younger brother, George. George had died of tuberculosis in 1856. So if you think about those numbers in your head, he died 2 years before the cemetery was created, which means he had to have been laid to rest somewhere else first. And that location was what we refer to as Potter's Field, which I will talk about more in a little bit. But it was not an ideal place to be buried. It was an unofficial burial ground, if you will. That is why Pine Ridge is referred to as the first official burial ground. Potter's Field was sort of, in a way, just a free-for-all for people to go and bury people and have a place to put those that had been deceased. And James Burnie did not like that that is where his brother was laid to rest, so he set aside this piece of property to be a cemetery and a proper burial place for his brother. And then, of course, he later went on to allow others to bury their loved ones there as well. The cemetery contains about 1,500 marked plots. And I always find it amazing that when you look at this map, it makes it look massive. But if any of you actually have ever driven by the cemetery and have seen it in real life, it is actually much smaller than it looks on here. So the plots are very cozy and very close together. But interesting enough, there are probably 2 to 3 times as many burials in this cemetery as there are designated plots. So they made the most of their space, and some of them are larger and were designed for more than one burial, but many of them were not. And there are very good reasons for why there are so many burials there, which will come up in a later section of the book. So what makes Pine Ridge so interesting is the cycle of ownership that it went through. Obviously, James Burnie was the original owner, and then when he passed away in 1888, it was inherited by his daughter, Sophie Burnie Blackwell, and she owned it until 1900 when she sold it to George Ames. And George Ames was a realtor and insurance agent in the area, and he owned it until his death in 1931. And at that time, his wife had no interest in taking care of a cemetery. I feel like that's probably understandable. And however, she didn't make an effort to sell it to anyone else, and she just kind of let it go. So since 1931, no one has owned the cemetery, and to this day, no one still owns the cemetery. It is not a government-run entity. It is not owned by the county or the city or the state. It is just a piece of property that is there, serves great purpose, but there is no one owning it, therefore no one who is officially responsible for its care. And so, as I'll talk about later, all of the care today is maintained by volunteers. And there was a very long period of time where no one cared for it, and it was so overgrown that one wouldn't even know it was a cemetery driving by, because it was so overgrown with brush and trees and plants. So thankfully now we have the volunteers that do care for it and give it the respect that it deserves. So again, here you see the plot map. If you look at it this way, Tuscola Road is Tuscola Plank Road, so today it would just be North Tuscola Road, and that is where your main entrance to the cemetery is. And then at the top, that would be Ridge Road. And so if you follow that along, there are other local cemeteries in that area. Just for reference, if you're not entirely sure where it is, across the street from it is Green Ridge Cemetery, and behind that is the hospital. So you're in that general area where there's all kinds of cemeteries sort of grouped together. In the center of this slide, that is Judge James Burnie, so he is the founder of the cemetery. And on the left, that is the grave marker that he and his siblings had built for his brother, George. And it is a unique style. It at the top looks broken, but that is intentional. And I'll talk a little bit more about gravestone symbolism later, but definitely intentional. And then on the left, you see just the inscription that is on the front of the marker. There's also an interesting story with this marker, because until very recently, it was not in this form. It was broken and has been repaired by the volunteers of the cemetery. So this is my favorite chapter, because I think that this is very interesting to think that this is even a possibility. But I mentioned Elm Lawn Cemetery and I mentioned Potter's Field, and I mentioned both of those because they are all very much intertwined. Back during this time, because Potter's Field was the unofficial burial ground and there were no records kept. The earliest known burial is in 1840 and the last known is in 1868, so people did still utilize this after the formation of Pine Ridge. But it was just a public burial ground. It wouldn't have cost anything other than your own fees to bury the individual there, but you wouldn't have had to have bought a plot. It was just sort of an unorganized mess of burials. And it's a concept that is still used today. There is a very famous Potter's Field in Long Island Sound where there are over 750,000 burials. And typically those are just used for people who cannot afford burials, unidentified bodies, and often prisoners. And so you can understand why people in Bay City didn't want their loved ones to be buried in a place like this. So when Pine Ridge was formed and Burnie used it for his own brother, he then opened it up to others. And he did not charge people initially for plots. He only had them pay a fee to exhume and move the bodies of their loved ones there, and then for any type of marker that they would like. Where it gets tricky is that records were so spotty at this time, we essentially have no idea how many people were actually moved from Potter's Field to Pine Ridge, or if they were actually moved at all. It's very possible that people just put grave markers in Pine Ridge for their loved ones as a memorial. So we don't actually know if the people were moved there or not. And so that's where we get sort of those mixed up numbers where we're unsure of how many people are there. And so after that, we have a move again, because in 1890, Elm Lawn Cemetery was opened. And this is sort of the first corporate cemetery where it had a larger ownership. Still an active cemetery today, unlike Pine Ridge, which is no longer active for burials. And if you go just down the road, Elm Lawn is just down the road from Pine Ridge. And in an advertisement for Elm Lawn Cemetery, it was referred to as the place to be buried. I'm not sure you would often think about it that way, but someone was very creative when they wrote the ad for that, because it worked. And now all of these people who were buried in Pine Ridge, their loved ones wanted them to be buried in Elm Lawn because that was the place to be. So they again moved individuals from Pine Ridge to Elm Lawn, and it's another one of those cases where, did they move the people? Did they move the markers? Did they just put a new marker in Elm Lawn? We don't know. And so in the terms of all three of them, although Potter's Field doesn't actually exist anymore, there are some very disturbing articles from the Bay City Times about them building buildings where Potter's Field was located and discovering the remains of the cemetery there. And so that doesn't exist anymore, but Elm Lawn does. And so their own burial records may be a bit off as well because we don't know who was moved where at which time. So I thought that was very interesting when I was researching that it was just that easy to up and move people, or at least put on the appearance that you did. So Pine Ridge Cemetery is primarily known for the number of Civil War veterans that are buried there. It is actually, if you go there today, the sign will show you that it is called Soldiers Rest Cemetery. And in 2014, that was an official name change because there is a single section of the cemetery known as Soldiers Rest. And that is where not all, but many of the Civil War veterans are buried. So there are approximately 154 Civil War burials. Again, with the records of the time being not always 100% accurate, it's hard to know, but there could be more of them. And so if you go to the cemetery and go in the main entrance, in the back left is where you find the Soldiers Rest section. There's a large monument there that is not a grave marker, but it's just a monument to the area that was donated by the local chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic. And there are also some other things. There's a howitzer siege gun that is there that was also donated by them, sort of as a decoration for the area. And it's easy to spot that area because pretty much all of the grave markers are your standard white military government issued marker. So if you visit the cemetery, that area definitely stands out. There are also veterans of other wars buried in the cemetery. There's approximately 25 that are known, and they range from the War of 1812 to the Korean War. So the images on this slide show Soldiers Rest. The marker on the left is the large marker that just denotes the area, so it's not actually a tombstone for an individual. It's just a monument for all that are buried there. And then you can see on the right how the markers sort of form semicircles. There are several rows of the stones around the marker that has been placed in that area. So my book features information about several of the notable veterans. Sometimes it's hard to find information about them beyond what's given to us just on their grave marker or perhaps a death certificate. But I just picked a few of the stories that I found unique to share with you today. So the first one that I selected, and that is because of his involvement in an important battle in the war, is Private Henry Schindehet. And he is one of the several veterans from Pine Ridge who fought in the Battle of Gettysburg. He was a German native who enlisted in Detroit on his 22nd birthday. And he ended up being involved in the Battle of Gettysburg, but he was unfortunately shot in the thigh and injured on June 1st, 1863, which was the first of the 3 days of that battle. And it was an injury that while he would recover from it, it would plague him for the rest of his life and ultimately play a role in his death many years later. He actually met his wife while he was in the Harper Hospital in Detroit recovering, and after they married, they later came to the Bay City area. He, while in Bay City, served as a U.S. Marshal, and he was also the owner of the National Hotel. And he did not die until 1907, but he died, his death certificate shows, from tetanus. And it is very likely that the tetanus was linked back to an infection of his war wound, even though it was from many years earlier. He is actually not buried in Soldiers Rest section of the cemetery. Many of them are scattered throughout, but the large number of them are buried in that section. But he is buried very close by, and he does have a military marker as well. So those are also easy to spot. And then during the holiday seasons, all of those will have the American flag by them as well. Another individual from the Civil War that I find interesting is Andrew Walton, and that is because he demonstrates an impressive skill that I don't think many of us could even ever imagine being capable of. When he enlisted in 1862, he joined Company C of the 1st United States, and that company was nicknamed Berdan's Sharpshooters to honor a legendary marksman. And to be a member of the Sharpshooters, you had to be able to place 10 shots in a 10-inch circle from 200 yards away. So to me that seems impossible, but there were a group of men that were capable of it, and they were given the special honor of being a part of this group. They were set apart from the other men. They had special green uniforms, and they had fur packs, and they used a Sharps rifle, so that's why we also call them the sharpshooters. He only was a member of this group for 2 years. He transferred out in 1864. And then he mustered out of service the next year. So he wasn't injured or killed during war as many of the soldiers were. Many of them are just veterans. But I found his skill impressive that he was able to be a successful member of this group. He came to Bay City in 1879, so some years after he mustered out. And he is also important because for some time he ran the poorhouse in Bay City. And that also has unique connections back to Civil War veterans because unfortunately at this time there were not veterans benefits like there are today. If there were, they were very little and barely enough to survive on. And so unfortunately many veterans of the Civil War often ended up in places like poorhouses because injuries kept them from being able to work, or the trauma from war kept them from being able to work successfully, and they didn't have the opportunities that veterans today do. And so they ended up in places like poorhouses where many of them unfortunately died and were buried in common graves that we now don't have markers to recognize them for. So he ran the poorhouse in Bay County for some time. And he is also not buried in Soldiers Rest. I didn't pick individuals who were, not because they aren't included in my book, I just picked ones whose stories I enjoyed. And his grave is marked with a rotary plaque because of the service he did to Bay City, and there are several other people, not just soldiers, throughout the cemetery if you walk around that are marked with plaques from the Rotary Club to indicate their significance to the region. So when we look at other wars, the first person that I picked to talk about today is Reverend Avery Dennison. And I picked him because he is the only known veteran in the cemetery who served in the War of 1812. He was born in 1790, and he served during the War of 1812, which has significant connections, of course, to Michigan, one of the only wars that actually saw combat here. And he became a minister after the War of 1812. He became an ordained minister in 1814, and he did not move to Bay City until the very end of his life. He moved to Bay City in 1865. And there's a quote from him that I really enjoy. He was a firm supporter of the Civil War, although he was in his 70s at that time. And he's quoted as saying, "If my old limbs would stand it, I would go fight again." So if he wouldn't have been 70, he probably would have been a Civil War veteran as well. But he only resided in Bay City, unfortunately, for a year before his death. He died in 1866. And his burial plot is impressive. He is buried on the opposite side of the cemetery from Soldiers Rest. He has a very large, very tall monument to mark his place, and he also has a rotary plaque as well. And his markers is one of the ones that we believe is damaged. In speaking with Ron Graham, he believes there's possibly a large urn that should be at the top of it because it looks incomplete when you look at it. It looks like something should have been up there, but through the time he's spent looking for things, nothing's been discovered yet to replace the top of that monument, although there have been for others. So it's impressive as it stands now, but I can imagine that it would be a lot more impressive and much taller had that piece still be in place. Another unique veteran from a war other than the Civil War is Private Clarence Fields, and he served in a lesser-known conflict. He was a member of the 339th Michigan Infantry, and they traveled to Russia and were involved in the Polar Bear Expedition. That took place at the conclusion of World War I, and it was an attempt to stop the spread of German influence in Russia. And many troops from Michigan were involved. It was not a very large conflict, so there weren't many U.S. troops present, but the majority of them were from Michigan. And this conflict lasted from September of 1918 to June of 1919, and it was not a successful venture. When you look at the history of it, people really don't want to talk about it happening because it was not one of our best ideas. And Fields was killed very early on in the conflict. He died on September 18th, 1918, so he died within the first month of this expedition. And he is buried in Soldiers Rest, but as you can see from the image, his marker is very difficult to read. And even being one of the newer ones, I'm not sure what would have caused it to be like that compared to the others, but I know when I went to look for the markers to take the images for the book, I had a hard time finding his just because it is difficult to read. And the polar bear expedition is interesting because in addition to all the connections to Michigan, the Historic Research Library at at U of M has a very, very large collection of artifacts and information about this. So it was very easy for me to find information because they have a very nice website that has it all digitalized. So the next chapter of my book moves on from talking about the veterans, although they're a large part of the cemetery. Bay County historians are, or not historians, Bay County people that were there at the start, so the people that founded the city are buried there as well. And there are also many notable families who are buried there. And you notice even just standing at the entrance to the museum, one of our notable families has a quote right at the entrance to the museum. It's one of the first things you see as you walk in. So that family would be the Mccormick family. And the Mccormick family was the first family to ship lumber in the region. When you first pull into the cemetery, they have a very, very large plot right straight at the entrance before you split off and go either direction. They arrived in the region in 1841. And as far as records can tell us, there are at least 10 members of the family buried here. But it's very likely that there may be more as well. The exact number is unknown just because there are numerous children buried in this section as well, and sometimes it's hard to keep track of the records for the burials of children, which I will talk about in a little bit. There is also, in addition to the various markers, you can see right in front of the large family marker, there is a military marker in this section, and that's for Archibald Mccormick. He fought in the Civil War, but he was killed in action. And we don't know if his remains were returned to Bay City or not. It would have been very, very costly at this time for that to happen. And the Mccormick family could have afforded it, though, because they were a wealthy family. So it's very likely that they were. And for technical purposes, in order to have a military marker, there must be evidence that you are actually buried there. So it's very likely that he is, or his family was able to pull off getting the marker without him actually being there. The large family marker in the center was actually broken. You can see the image on the right shows the entire top portion of it on the ground. And this is one of the things that Ron Graham was able to find through probing the ground, and found the broken piece, dug it up from under the ground, and then with the help of volunteer local businesses who could bring in the equipment to lift it back into place, because this is granite, so it's very, very heavy. They brought a small crane-like thing in, and they were able to lift it up and repair it. I was there early on, shortly after he found it, and I was able to take the picture of it on the ground. And while it was impressive there, it was incredible to be able to go back after it had been repaired and see it in its rightful place and see how really large and impressive the monument is. And this is not the only marker in the area that has been like this. There are several others that have been repaired in this way over the last few years. Another notable family is the Barney family. I've always had a hard time keeping Burnie and Barney straight. As I was writing the book, I had to go back and proofread multiple times to make sure I had the right names in the right places. The Barney family was the second in the area to own a lumber mill. Their large family plot is located almost directly behind the Mccormick plot in the front of the cemetery. The patriarch of this family, Cromwell Barney, brought his family to the region in 1837. And his daughter Mary holds a unique title. She was born in 1838, and she is recorded as being the first baby girl to be born in the county. Possibly could have happened before, but with records, we don't know. But she is the first to have been recorded. Cromwell's wife, Belinda, was one of the last surviving Bay County pioneers. She lived to be 80. And we are not 100% sure if she is buried in this plot or not. There aren't firm records on that, but it is likely that she might be. This plot, you can see within the enclosed area, has numerous markers as well, but we don't know the exact number of actual burials because in the back there are several that indicate that they are burials for babies or children. And this one, as you can see, is also marked with a rotary plaque to indicate his significance in the region. Some notable individuals I couldn't help but include Elizabeth Dare because she was the first teacher in Bay County. So as a teacher myself, she sort of held a special place for me. She was born in 1820 in New Hampshire. We don't know exactly when she arrived in Bay County. But in 1837, the Michigan primary school law was passed, and that required that areas that were large enough to sustain a population of a certain size had to provide some type of public education. So Dare, then Clark, because she was not married, was appointed the first teacher in the region. She had 9 regular students. I wish I only had 9 regular students. I can't even imagine only having 9 students in a classroom with the numbers we have today. In 1941, she married Frederick Dare, who was an important person in the region. He held several different positions and had several different roles in the area. But unfortunately, their marriage was quite short. Her actual death records are difficult to find, but she died in either 1842 or 1843. So they were only married for a year or 2 before she died. And she was also quite young, which was not unusual for this time. She is an interesting case of a potentially moved grave because, if you might have noticed, her death predates the cemetery. Cemetery was not founded until 1858. So it's very likely that she was buried in Potter's Field to start out with, so of course we don't know if she was actually moved from one place to the other or not, or if it's just the marker, because she does have a tombstone in Pine Ridge. Chapter 6 of my book talks about other interesting residents of Pine Ridge, so perhaps people that didn't play a role in the founding of the area, but have an interesting story to tell. So I just picked a few of those to share with you today as well. The first of those individuals is George Wellman. So this is a bit of a cowboy story here. He was born in Canada in 1858, and he came with his family to the Bay City area in 1884. But he soon after left to go to Wyoming, where he was a well-respected ranch hand and later appointed a U.S. Marshal position out there. He returned to Bay City in 1892, and while he was back home, he married a woman named Lucy Clark. But unfortunately, they were not together very long before he was called back to Wyoming. At this time, there was a conflict taking place called the Johnson County War. And while it was not an official war, it was a conflict between large and small ranch owners in Wyoming. And while he was riding his horse down the road in Wyoming, he was shot in the back and murdered while traveling to his designated location. His death was tragic to people both in Wyoming and in Bay City because he was very well respected in both locations. Funeral services were held in both areas, and his family did pay for his remains to be returned to Bay City via train, which would have been very, very costly at that time, and you can imagine quite difficult because they did not have modern technology. Eventually, 3 men were put on trial for his murder, but none of them were ever convicted of any crime. And it is believed that his murder was possibly the work of a large ranch owner that did not like him trying to stop the conflict out there, but a bit of a mystery. And so he has a grave marker in the cemetery as well as a rotary plaque because of his not necessarily notable contributions to Bay City, but his efforts as a U.S. Marshal in Wyoming. So this next story is one of my favorite stories from the cemetery. I think I've told this story to every person that I've ever talked to my book about just because it's so interesting to me. So when you look at the sexton's records or the burial records of the cemetery, on August 1st, 1900, on lot 864, it very clearly says that the leg of Edward Gore was buried there. Not him, just his leg. And so, of course, that stood out to me as something that was interesting. We don't know why he lost his limb or why it was given such a formal burial. I have a cousin who works in the hospital, and I had to ask her, I'm like, what do you do with amputated limbs? Do they usually get a burial? And she was like, not usually. So this was interesting to me of why someone would go through the process of buying a plot and burying their leg somewhere. Through her research, Clara Pascoe has found that the location where it is even has its own grave marker. There's a brick with the initials EG carved into it, and so that would indicate that he not only buried his leg there, but also gave it a marker so he could remember where it was. Interesting enough, he didn't die for almost 40 years after his leg was buried there. He died on August 8th, 1939. I was able to find his death records through some wonderful websites that the state of Michigan have put up now, with being able to pull up very old death records. And his cause of death was acute heart failure and a prostate condition, so nothing that would seem to be connected to the loss of a limb. And ironically, he is not buried in Pine Ridge Cemetery. He is buried down the road in Elm Lawn. So his leg is buried in Pine Ridge, but he is in the place to be buried down the road in Elm Lawn. So I just always found that one to be an interesting story, because not only is it odd to me that you would go through an elaborate burial for your leg, but then you wouldn't even put the rest of yourself there with it. So the second half of my book talks less about the specific people buried in Pine Ridge and more about what we can learn from the cemetery. As it was mentioned in my introduction, I think it's so important to constantly be learning about the past and sharing it through different stories with future and present generations so they don't become forgotten. So cemeteries, not just Pine Ridge, can be a really interesting window to the past. We can learn much more from them than the names of the people that are buried there. They can actually tell us a lot about society and the way things were during the time in which they were in their prime. So one thing is the plot size. As you noticed on the chart, there were some that were marked off as large and some that were marked off as small. So the size plot you had was a good indicator of how wealthy your family was. People like the McCormicks and the Burnies, who have the expansive plots marked off with the cement, which wasn't just for decoration, that was to keep other people out, because people had no problem going after dark and doing their own burials if they didn't want to pay for it to be done. There are stories in the Bay City Times of caretakers going to the cemetery the next morning and finding freshly dug graves that they had nothing to do with. So wealthy families put those cement markers around their plot to sort of fence it off and claim it as their own. But families that did not have their wealth would have had the single graves that you've seen on the chart, and they made the most of them. It was not uncommon to stack burials on top of one another as much as you possibly could to get the most out of your space. So that definitely explains why we have possibly 2 to 3 times as many burials as we do designated plots in Pine Ridge. Something that one day would be a wonderful asset to understanding the cemetery better is if the cemetery could have a ground scan done. Universities have the equipment that could scan the ground and show exactly where the burials are and how many there are. And I think it would be very interesting to actually get the numbers beyond what we can tell with the records. Another thing we can learn from any cemetery in addition to Pine Ridge is symbolism. It's very easy to see the values of a time based on the symbols used on grave markers. One very commonly used example is the lamb. You'll often find a lamb either like resting on top of or carved into grave markers for babies and children. Another example is the broken stump that we saw on the grave marker of George Burnie at the beginning. And that was often used to represent a life that had been cut short. So not necessarily a child like the lamb would represent, but someone who died either unfortunately due to some type of disease, or like George Wellman, who had been murdered, someone who wasn't a natural death. So it looks like it's unintentional, but it is intentional that it shows how the life was cut short. Another example that you'll see in many places, and not as many examples in Pine Ridge, but several of them, flowers are often on the graves of women, and they represented things like love. And on the next slides, I have some images from Pine Ridge to show examples of those. Something else that you can learn from cemeteries, you can learn about disease or epidemics that may have taken place in a region. Bay City did not have a formal hospital until 1899, and as a result, it was very, very easy for a simple disease to become an epidemic and unfortunately take the lives of many people. There has been a recorded epidemic of smallpox in Bay City in 1869 and 1877. So if you correlate records of deaths with that time period, you might see a rise in the number. Many local historians believe that prior to the formation of Pine Ridge, there was also an outbreak of typhoid that would have led to a large number of burials in Pottersfield, which then could have eventually been moved to Pine Ridge. And in 1918, there was also an epidemic of the Spanish influenza in the region. So all of those things, if you study those time periods with the number of burials from those times, it will be reflective that the numbers are higher than they would have been in other times. One of the last things that we can learn about the past, and that is reflected, unfortunately, in Pine Ridge's own story, is the large number of infant and child deaths during this time. The records from the cemetery tell us that of the burials there are at least 850 burials of children. But again, with the records, there are likely several missing. And unfortunately, too, another thing with children, if they were babies, often stillborn babies at this time were not issued birth or death certificates, so it's nearly impossible to keep track of them. The tombstone that's on the cover of my book is for a set of twins. Their names are Houghton and Naughton McDowell, and I think those are great names. That's why I picked that one for the cover. And I have researched, Claire Pascoe has researched, they don't exist in records. Their parents have built an elaborate tombstone for them because this tombstone is one that is very tall. So obviously they existed, but in terms of records, there's nothing. So it's very likely that they fit the case here, with them being a stillborn child that was not given any record. And then additionally, in Pine Ridge, if you go to the back of the cemetery along the back fence line, there is an area there that was reserved and called Baby Row. And that is where there are numerous burials of babies where they put multiple plots and they just had them available for parents who couldn't afford a plot of their own. So the records there are also difficult to keep track of, which means that that number of 850 is much higher in actuality. We just don't have the way to prove that. And any cemetery that is popular during this time period will show the same thing. A couple images to demonstrate the symbolism that you can find in the cemetery. The image on the left, those are actually in the Barney family plot. But you can see that the one in the center has the small lamb on the top of it. And in addition to that, this one also utilizes the tin markers along the top. It's not the caskets coming to the top. They were just there for decoration. And you can see that by the size of those, that they are small. So that's another indicator that those are the graves of children. And then the image on the right is actually George Burnie's marker before it was repaired. So the pictures you saw at the beginning are the marker after its repair. But before it was repaired, it was found this way. And it was initially believed that it was actually broken. But then when you inspect it further, you can see that where the broken off design is finished. So it's intentionally done that way. And since finding that information out and writing this book, and I've been to numerous other historic cemeteries, it's a very common symbol. I've seen them multiple other places and in different forms. So the final chapters of the book talk about where the cemetery stands currently and what it will look like in the future. So currently the cemetery is primarily cared for by a group called the Friends of Pine Ridge Cemetery and the caretaker Ron Graham. They are all volunteers. It is no one's job to take care of the cemetery. It is something they do on their own time because it's something that they're passionate about. In 2015, Graham was awarded a local community improvement award for all of the work that he does in the cemetery. And anytime you drive by the cemetery, it's very likely that you'll find him there working on something, probing for different markers, cutting the grass, pulling the weeds. Every time I was there for my research, he was always there doing something. And in addition to that, the volunteers who are part of the group organize different events. There's usually a fall and spring cleanup for the cemetery. Different local groups will come in, and schools, school groups and things like that, and work on helping to clean up as well. But without that care, it would very easily fall back into the state that it was after George Ames passed away, where it would be likely unidentifiable as a cemetery. In the past, there have unfortunately been cases of vandalism in the cemetery. In 2014, there was a case where numerous markers were knocked over and broken throughout the cemetery, but with the help of volunteers, most of those were able to be repaired if they were salvageable. And then more recently, during the winter months, on 2 different occasions, a car struck the fence in a couple different spots. And those, thankfully, now too have been repaired with some fundraising and some volunteer work and some donation of time to fix the fences. But thankfully, during those incidents, it was just the fence that was damaged and none of the markers inside received any damage. Something too that has been going on recently is replacement of military markers. If you go to the Soldiers' Rest section, you'll find there are several spots where the tomb is just marked with a PVC pipe in the ground. And that is because they either never had a marker or it is missing. And it is not easy to get a military marker. You have to have proof, of course, that the person served, proof that they're buried there, and you also have to have permission from a living relative. So that's the part where it could be tricky. It's easy to find military records and burial records, but if that person has no one either living in the area or no one that can be tracked down, it's very tricky to go about the paperwork to get those. But in the past few years, they have been able to replace several of those markers. So in the future, the volunteers, of course, will be able to continue helping the cemetery. Funding is something that is always difficult to buy. You can have the people volunteer their time to come cut the grass, but the lawnmower doesn't run on volunteers' time. And you just need other things as well to go into the upkeep. It's of course easy to find volunteers and people who are willing to donate their time to fix things, but as with the fence, there was still a cost behind that as well. And it seems like the knowledge of the cemetery is becoming more known in the area, but so many people don't know that it is there. And perhaps if more people were easily able to get knowledge of the cemetery, you might get more interest in it. I know that the records that Claire Pascoe has worked very, very hard to compile on the cemetery are finally available online on the Bay County Historical Society's website. And so that is something too that will hopefully spur the interest of people in the future if they're interested in that in general, or if they're coming to look for a specific relative who may be buried in the cemetery. So I'm going to leave you today with a quote that I discovered while I was writing my book, and this is something that really stood out to me. This is from a book called Fear Nothing by Dean Koontz, and it is about cemeteries and the symbolism and history behind them. And so in his book, he writes, "Gravestones are like rows of books bearing the names of those whose names have been blotted from the pages of life, who have been forgotten elsewhere but are remembered here." And when I found that quote, I knew it was something I needed to include in my book. It's how I start out the final chapter. And although I felt this way after all of the time researching, it really kind of put it all together and tied it in a neat bow for me. As someone, like I mentioned, who was terrified of cemeteries but loved history, I never really had the appreciation for what they could show us. And I feel like, unfortunately, there are many people who sort of have that same mindset that I did. And I think that if we can get people in the world interested in cemeteries and understanding what they can teach us, and how that is how we remember the people who are no longer with us, that perhaps, unfortunately, Pine Ridge will never, or fortunately, Pine Ridge will never fall into the state that it was. And it may not happen to other cemeteries as well, because Pine Ridge is certainly not the only cemetery in the country that has faced that, or even in this area. But they are not lucky enough to have people like the Friends of Pine Ridge who have brought it back to what it is today. So I leave you with that and hope that you keep this in mind as you go around and see different historic cemeteries throughout the area and other places. Thank you. So as they mentioned at the beginning, I'll be here for a little bit with my books. I know that they are going to keep some in the gift shop as well if it's something that you're interested in the future. And I also have some cards with the information because they are available on Amazon. Yes.
Yes, you mentioned events. I would like to mention one that is coming up in Pine Ridge on 11/11/11, which is the Sunday. I know most of you know 11/11/11 is the anniversary of the end of World War I. We have a gentleman, Corporal Harding, who is not buried there but has a plaque, and there will be a ceremony around his grave on that day commemorating the end of World War I. Everyone is invited.
Yes.
Well, I read years ago that there's a General Burnie. Does that have anything to do with this?
Yes. The Barney family do have several markers with military connections in theirs too. Yep. They're all the Burnies are related in Bay City.
One other thing, you mentioned stillborns were usually not there with the grave certificate. Well, my oldest sister that was stillborn, my oldest sister had died, but she said if the youngest one had lived, it would have been 2 against 4. I'm the last survivor of our family, but I found out they're in Oak Ridge Cemetery, and I went over and I talked to the sexton there, and he went through and tried to find, and we found a death certificate for her when she was stillborn. And he says, he said he didn't know where she was buried there in the cemetery. He said, any other names? And I told him, Grandma Moon. He looked on Grandma Moon, he says, no, nothing there. I said, look on the next page. Her name was on another one. My father's name was the, what do they call him? The burial person.
Yeah. When you look at the records for Pine Ridge, there are many like that where it says, you know, child of, or just baby with a last name. And so even then it's difficult to keep track, especially if the same family had multiple children buried there. It was hard to keep track of which one would have been which.
The sexton allowed me to put a memorial stone near their tombstone. He says, you can't put it on somebody else's grave. So I put it on theirs.
Are there records somewhere?
Yes, there are some very spotty records, and as far as I know, that the museum still holds the original copies of the records here, that they have them. I don't think they're on display, but I do think that they are in the archives.
In the research library. Right, Claire?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or on library?
Yes, findagrave.com is also a great resource if you are looking. Unfortunately, it is easy to edit some of the information. I sort of refer to it as like the Wikipedia of cemeteries, but for the most part, I found it to be pretty accurate. Yeah.
I've always heard the story about the first person to go over to Niagara Falls, a woman, school teacher from Bay City. Have you heard that story?
I have not.
Yeah.
Where is she buried at?
New York.
New York.
In New York.
Oh, in New York? Well, she's not buried, but yeah, she did teach here in Bay City.
Interesting. Yes.
I had an aunt that when she was like 13, they had to amputate her leg because of cancer. And they buried it in the backyard, and she would scream every night, it hurt herself. They took the leg out, it was covered in water and mud, whatever, took it out to Oak Ridge Cemetery. She never had any more pain, and she was then buried 80 years later with her leg.
So at least she's, unlike Edward Gore, she's at least with it, but that's what I imagined, that there was some connection and sort of maybe a spiritual thing, that's why it had the elaborate burial, but it's just a fun story to tell people. So if anybody has any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them, or if you're interested in a book, we'll be here for a little bit after, and I know there's cookies and other refreshments in the back too if you didn't get a chance.